Letting go of ego is not about losing yourself, nor is it about becoming invisible or unimportant. Often buried under layers of pride, fear, and the constant need to prove yourself. The book How to Let Go of Ego invites us into a journey where the walls we have built to protect ourselves are gently dismantled, revealing a deeper, freer, and more compassionate self beneath. The ego, as the author explains, is not inherently evil. It is simply the part of us that has learned to survive in a world that often values appearance over authenticity. It thrives on comparison, control, and validation. The challenge is that when we let the ego lead our lives, we mistake its voice for our own. We become trapped in cycles of needing to be right, needing to be seen, needing to be better than others, and in that trap, we lose touch with peace. The first step in letting go of ego is awareness. You cannot release what you cannot see. The author urges us to watch our thoughts and reactions in everyday life, like a compassionate observer. Notice the moments when you feel a strong need to defend yourself in a conversation, the urge to interrupt someone so your point is heard, or the quiet disappointment when someone else gets the recognition you hoped for. These moments are not signs that you are bad or broken, they are simply invitations to notice the ego in action. The author likens it to a child who is frightened and clamoring for attention. You can't quiet the child by yelling back, but you can offer understanding and patience. Awareness without judgment becomes the key that opens the door to change. From awareness, the book moves into acceptance. The ego often thrives on resistance. When we feel jealous, angry, or superior, we may try to push those feelings away or cover them with false positivity. But the author reminds us that suppressing the ego only strengthens it. Instead, we must acknowledge it with honesty. If we are jealous, we can say, "Yes, in this moment, I feel envy," without adding the layer of shame or self-criticism. Paradoxically, by accepting the presence of ego, we loosen its grip. This acceptance allows us to separate ourselves from the emotion or thought and see it as passing weather rather than a fixed identity. One of the book's most profound insights is the recognition that the ego feeds on stories about who we are, who others are, and how the world should work. These stories can become cages. We might cling to the belief, "I am the kind of person who always needs to be in control," or, "People never appreciate me," or, "I have to be successful to be worthy." The author challenges us to ask, is this story actually true? Or is it simply a habit of thought? By questioning these narratives, we begin to loosen their hold. One example given is of a man who believed his worth was tied to his job title. When he lost his position, his sense of self collapsed. Through deep inner work, he realized that beneath the title, he was still the same kind, creative, and resourceful person. His title was never his identity, it was just a role his ego had mistaken for the self. Humility emerges as a natural result of letting go. True humility is not about thinking less of yourself, it's about thinking of yourself less often. It allows you to walk into a room without needing to be the center of attention, to celebrate someone else's success without feeling diminished, to listen without preparing your response in your mind. The author describes humility as the quiet strength that comes from knowing you are enough, without the need to prove it. In practical life, this might mean allowing your partner to have the last word in an argument, not because you're defeated, but because peace matters more than being right. It might mean taking responsibility for a mistake at work instead of hiding it, trusting that your worth is not defined by perfection. The book also explores the deep connection between ego and fear. The ego fears losing control, being judged, or being less than in the eyes of others. These fears drive many of our defensive or competitive behaviors. But when we recognize that the worst-case scenarios the ego imagines are often exaggerated or untrue, we can respond with courage rather than panic. A woman in the book shares how she always feared speaking up in meetings, worried people would think her ideas were foolish. Over time, she realized this fear was her ego's way of protecting her from potential embarrassment, but in doing so, it was also keeping her small. By gently stepping into situations that challenged this fear, she found that even if her ideas were not always accepted, she still gained respect for her authenticity and willingness to contribute. A powerful theme that runs through the book is compassion, not only for others but for ourselves. The author explains that much of our ego-driven behavior comes from old wounds. Perhaps as children we felt unseen, so now we strive endlessly for recognition. Or maybe we were criticized harshly, so we now defend ourselves at every turn. When we understand the origins of these patterns, we can meet them with kindness rather than self-rejection. Letting go of ego does not mean erasing the parts of us that have been shaped by pain, it means healing them so they no longer need to shout to be heard. In daily life, this might look like forgiving yourself for a harsh reaction, apologizing sincerely to someone you've hurt, or choosing patience over retaliation. The book encourages cultivating stillness in presence as an antidote to the ego's constant chatter. The ego lives in the past and future, replaying old grievances or anticipating future triumphs and failures. But in the present moment, its grip weakens. Practices like meditation, mindful breathing, or simply pausing before reacting can create space between stimulus and response. The author shares how, during a heated argument, taking just one deep breath before speaking can shift the entire tone of the interaction. In that pause, you may remember that kindness is more important than winning, that connection matters more than being right. An important distinction made is that letting go of ego is not a one-time event, but a lifelong practice. Just as we cannot take one deep breath and expect to be oxygenated forever, we cannot let go of ego once and expect it never to return. It will arise again, in subtle ways, in new situations, in moments when we least expect it. The work is in noticing it sooner, recovering faster, and choosing differently. This practice becomes easier with time, not because the ego disappears, but because we no longer confuse it with our true self. As the book reaches its deeper spiritual reflections, it suggests that beyond the ego lies our authentic essence, the part of us that is connected to everything and everyone. In this space, there is no need to compare or compete, because there is no separation. We can rejoice in others' happiness as our own. We can face loss with grace, knowing we are more than what we possess. We can give without expecting anything in return because we no longer believe giving diminishes us. The author calls this state, coming home, for it is a return to the wholeness that has always been within us. In one of the closing stories, a man spends years climbing the ladder of success, fueled by the desire to outshine his peers. When he finally reaches the top, he feels an emptiness he cannot explain. Through a series of life changes, losing his job, traveling, and reconnecting with old friends, he realizes that the joy he sought was never in the applause, but in the genuine connections and moments of presence along the way. His story becomes a reminder that letting go of ego is not the end of ambition, but the beginning of living with purpose. By the end, How to Let Go of Ego leaves us with a simple but profound truth: you do not have to prove your worth. You were enough the day you were born, and you remain enough now. The ego will always try to convince you otherwise, but you can meet it with awareness, acceptance, and compassion. You can choose humility over pride, connection over competition, presence over performance. And in doing so, you open the door to a life of greater peace, authenticity, and joy. The journey is not about becoming less of yourself, but about becoming more real, peeling away the layers of fear, pride, and pretense until only your truest self remains. And when you live from that place, you don't just free yourself from the ego's grasp, you become a light for others, showing them that there is another way to live, a way rooted not in the need to be somebody, but in the freedom of simply being. Continuing deeper into How to Let Go of Ego, the book shifts from recognizing and releasing the ego to consciously living a life guided by the heart rather than by the restless demands of pride, fear, and control. The author emphasizes that the ego is not just an internal voice, it shapes how we relate to the world, the choices we make, the relationships we nurture, and even the way we interpret events. To live free of its constant influence, we must not only quiet it within ourselves but also reshape the environments and habits that feed it. One of the first practices in this second stage is redefining success. The ego defines success in external terms: wealth, power, recognition, influence, and constantly compares us with others. But the heart defines success in terms of integrity, peace, and alignment with our values. The author shares a story of a young woman who left a high-paying corporate job to work in a small community garden. Her friends thought she was throwing her life away, but she felt more alive and fulfilled than she ever had. She no longer woke up with a knot in her stomach or fell asleep replaying stressful conversations in her mind. Her joy came from doing something meaningful, even if it didn't impress the world. This shift in perspective is a powerful antidote to the ego's endless craving for more. Another key theme is learning to listen more than we speak. The ego often seeks to dominate conversations, prove a point, or showcase intelligence. But when we truly listen, without the inner urge to respond, judge, or fix, we open space for real connection. The author recounts an exercise from a retreat where participants were asked to pair up, and one person would speak for 5 minutes while the other only listened, without nodding, interrupting, or offering advice. Many participants said it was the first time they felt genuinely heard in years. They also realized how difficult it was to quiet their own mind long enough to give someone else full attention. This practice, though simple, becomes a mirror showing us just how much the ego interrupts our relationships. Forgiveness is explored next as one of the most liberating steps in letting go. The ego thrives on grudges because they strengthen our sense of being right and make the other person wrong. But this sense of righteousness comes at a high cost. It keeps our hearts heavy and our minds occupied with resentment. Forgiving does not mean condoning harmful actions or pretending they did not hurt. It means freeing ourselves from the emotional prison that the ego builds around the wound. The author tells the story of a man who carried bitterness toward his brother for over a decade after a business dispute. When he finally confronted the reality that the grudge was poisoning his own life more than it was punishing his brother, he began the process of letting it go. That act of release allowed him to repair their relationship and, more importantly, restore his own peace. The book also delves into the subtle ways the ego shows up in our helping others. Sometimes, acts of generosity are not purely selfless but carry hidden expectations of praise, gratitude, or loyalty. This kind of giving keeps the ego alive because it makes the act about us rather than the other person. The author encourages practicing what they call invisible giving, doing something kind without leaving a trace, without telling anyone, without waiting for acknowledgement. Whether it's paying for a stranger's meal anonymously or leaving flowers on a neighbor's doorstep without a note, these acts train us to detach kindness from the need for recognition. An important practical tool offered is the pause before action. The ego often reacts instantly to perceived slights, challenges, or opportunities to prove itself. But by pausing, even for a few seconds, before responding, we allow a deeper wisdom to emerge. This pause can turn a heated argument into a calm discussion, a rash decision into a thoughtful choice. The author compares it to a musician holding a beat before the next note, creating space for the music to breathe. In our lives, that pause is where transformation happens, because it's the moment we choose not to be ruled by impulse or pride. Self-compassion is explored again, this time in the context of failure. The ego fears failure because it sees it as proof of unworthiness. But when we see failure as simply feedback, as part of the learning process, the fear loses its grip. The book shares the example of an entrepreneur who failed in 3 businesses before finally building a successful one. He credits his perseverance to his ability to separate his self-worth from his outcomes. The business failed, he said, but I didn't fail. I learned. This reframing allows us to take risks, pursue dreams, and grow without the constant fear of losing face. The second half of the book also speaks about relationships as a mirror for the ego. The people who irritate us often reflect qualities we have yet to face within ourselves. If someone's arrogance bothers us deeply, it may be because we carry our own unacknowledged pride. If we are easily hurt by criticism, it may be because our sense of self rests too heavily on others' approval. The author urges us to treat these moments not as proof of others' flaws, but as invitations to examine our own reactions. Over time, this approach transforms even difficult relationships into opportunities for growth. There's also a profound chapter on surrender, the art of letting life unfold without constant interference from the ego's plans. Surrender does not mean inaction or passivity, it means aligning with the flow of life rather than resisting it. The author likens it to sailing. You still steer the boat, but you work with the wind and currents rather than fighting them. In practice, this might look like accepting that a project didn't turn out the way you expected, but trusting it will lead to a different opportunity, or realizing that a relationship has run its course and releasing it with gratitude rather than clinging in fear of being alone. Toward the end, the book invites us to see life as a continuous practice of returning to the present moment. Every time we notice the ego pulling us into comparison, defensiveness, or self-importance, we can gently guide ourselves back, not with harsh discipline, but with kindness. Over the years, this practice becomes less about defeating the ego and more about befriending it, understanding its voice, and choosing when not to listen. The author leaves us with a vision of life lived lightly, where we can celebrate our wins without clinging to them, face our losses without being crushed, and move through the world with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing we are enough exactly as we are. Letting go of ego, then, is not a single act, but a way of walking through life. It is the daily choice to listen to the heart more than the mind's chatter, to value peace over victory, to see the sacred in every moment rather than chasing the next milestone. And as we make these choices, the world itself begins to feel different, not because it has changed, but because we have. In the final part of How to Let Go of Ego, the author turns our attention to the deeper, almost spiritual dimension of this work, the place where letting go of ego becomes more than a personal goal and begins to touch the way we experience life itself. By this point in the journey, we have learned to notice the ego's voice, to pause before reacting, to replace competition with compassion, and to live with humility. But there is still one more step, stepping fully into a life of authenticity, where the heart leads and the ego becomes a quiet, harmless companion rather than a loud, dominating force. The author describes authenticity as the natural state we return to when the layers of ego have been gently peeled away. In authenticity, our words match our values, our actions align with our deepest beliefs, and we no longer feel the need to hide behind masks. This doesn't mean we are perfect, far from it. It means we are honest about our imperfections, unafraid to admit when we are wrong, and unwilling to betray ourselves for the sake of approval. One example the book offers is of a teacher who once based her teaching style entirely on impressing parents and school officials. After years of burnout, she let go of the performance and began teaching from a place of genuine care for her students. Her classes became less polished, but far more impactful, and for the first time in years, she felt alive in her work. Another theme the author explores here is interconnectedness, the realization that we are not separate from one another, but part of the same human fabric. The ego thrives on separation, me versus you, my success versus your success, my safety versus your safety. But when we release the ego's grip, we begin to see that what harms one, harms all, and what blesses one, blesses all. The book shares a moving story of a man who spent years in cutthroat business competition, viewing his peers as rivals. After a personal crisis, he began to support others openly, recommending them for jobs, sharing resources, even celebrating their wins. To his surprise, his own opportunities grew. What he had once seen as a zero-sum game became a shared field where everyone's growth was possible. This shift from competition to collaboration is one of the clearest signs that ego has loosened its hold. The practice of gratitude takes on a deeper meaning in this stage. Gratitude without ego is not about listing blessings as proof that we are winning in life. It is about recognizing the gift of each moment, the taste of morning tea, the warmth of sunlight, the sound of laughter, without needing it to be more, bigger, or better. The ego constantly looks for the next thing. Gratitude roots us in the now. The author recalls walking through a park one afternoon and noticing a child marveling at an ant carrying a crumb. That child was not thinking about being more important than the ant, or about what other children might be doing, they were simply present. In that moment, the author realized that humility and gratitude are inseparable, both dissolve the ego's illusion of separateness. Forging a deeper relationship with silence also becomes essential. Silence, as the book explains, is where the ego's voice becomes quiet enough for us to hear the whisper of intuition. This is not just about meditating in a quiet room, but about cultivating inner stillness even in the midst of noise. It might mean driving without the radio, walking without headphones, or pausing in a conversation before responding. Over time, this practice rewires our relationship with the world. We stop feeling the constant need to fill the space with our opinions or accomplishments, and we begin to let things be. Silence stops feeling like emptiness and begins to feel like a sacred space where clarity and peace live. The author also speaks about service, giving ourselves to something larger than our own needs and desires. When we serve from the heart, without expecting reward, the ego naturally steps aside. Whether it's mentoring someone, volunteering, or simply being fully present for a friend, these acts remind us that our lives are part of a much bigger story. One of the most touching stories in the book is of a retired doctor who spends his mornings giving free checkups to people who cannot afford medical care. He says it is not charity, it is gratitude in action, a way of giving back for the blessings he has received. His work is not about recognition, it's about love. At the heart of the final chapters is the understanding that letting go of ego doesn't mean losing our individuality. It means expressing that individuality without the burden of needing it to be admired or validated. We can still pursue excellence, creativity, and ambition, but now those pursuits come from joy rather than fear, from love rather than insecurity. The author makes a beautiful point. When you are free of ego, your life becomes less about proving and more about expressing. The difference is subtle but life-changing. One is heavy and exhausting, the other is light and energizing. The book closes with an invitation, not a command, to live as a witness to your own life. To see each situation not as a test of your worth, but as a chance to deepen your presence, your compassion, your understanding. This perspective turns ordinary days into opportunities for spiritual growth. A delayed train becomes a chance to practice patience. A disagreement becomes a lesson in listening. A setback becomes a doorway to resilience. The ego would have us see these as inconveniences or insults, the heart sees them as sacred teachers. Ultimately, How to Let Go of Ego leaves us with a profound truth. We cannot kill the ego, and we shouldn't try. It is part of being human. But we can choose whether it leads or follows. When the ego follows, it still has its voice, but it no longer dictates the direction of our lives. Instead, our choices are guided by a deeper wisdom, one rooted in love, humility, and an unshakable sense of connection to all life. And so, the journey comes full circle. We begin with awareness of the ego's hold on us. We learn to observe it, to pause, to choose differently. We practice humility, compassion, presence, and gratitude. And in doing so, we return to a life where we are not trapped by the need to prove ourselves. We are free to be exactly who we are, no masks, no pretenses, no fear. In this freedom, life stops being a competition and becomes a shared celebration. And that, the author tells us, is the true gift of letting go.